pleasure to be here, and on behalf of the college to welcome you all to the annual event that seems to be a recurring fixture on my calendar. I get to come here almost, it seems, every year and welcome you. This is the 85th year that Albertus Magnus College has been operating in New Haven, serving students with a combination of innovation and excellence that has become our hallmark in terms of both traditional and non-traditional programs. We have 44 undergraduate programs, 8 graduate programs, and this afternoon I'm traveling up to Hartford, and if everything goes right, we will have approval from the Board of Governors of Higher Education to offer our first doctoral program in 2012. So now it's my pleasure to be able to introduce Matthew Bishop. Matthew is the U.S. business editor of The Economist and a former faculty member of the London Business School. He has served as a member of the Sykes Commission on the investment system in the 21st century, as well as on the advisors group of the United Nations International Year of Microcredit 2005, and has been honored as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. He has been interviewed on numerous media outlets, including NPR, BBC, CNBC, and The Charlie Rose Show, and is a published author as well. So it's my pleasure to welcome Matthew Bishop.
And before Matthew takes the microphone, I just want to tell you a very quick story. We had asked Matthew to speak at our annual meeting last April, and he agreed and was delighted to do it, and got caught in Europe with those volcano ash plumes that you remember, and his flight couldn't get in. He worked very hard to get one of his colleagues to come and do the job for us, and he did. That was a great replacement. But Matthew has almost been insisting that he be here to make up for that time that he thinks he messed us up. So we're indebted to Matthew for that. Thank you so much, Matthew.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was strange being stuck in Europe with that unpronounceable volcano. Just the skies were blue, and you couldn't really see any reason not to be able to fly back. But you know, there we were stuck. It was good to finally be here. The theme of my talk this morning is my new book, The Road from Ruin, which is, people often say, call it the road to ruin, but in fact it's an attempt to explain, you know, how we can get out of the economic mess that we're in at the moment. And the starting point of the book is an eruption that took place that has a more pronounceable name, Lehman Brothers. And basically that moment in September 2008, September the 15th, when Lehman Brothers went bust, as a reporter who covered the economy and Wall Street for many years, was one of those moments where I instantly felt convinced that this was a moment of real change, a paradigm shifting moment, a moment that we would look back in 25 years' time as a moment that shaped our world for a generation. As significant as many of those sort of historical moments, maybe as significant as the 29 crash and the Great Depression, or the Second World War, or the Vietnam War, in terms of setting the expectations of a generation. And I wanted, with my co-author in the book, to try and understand what had gone wrong and what we needed to do to put it right. And I'm just going to talk briefly about a few of the thoughts that we had. I can't possibly do justice to the book in terms of a few minutes speaking, and then also just to sort of update briefly what the world looks like to me and my colleagues at The Economist now, as we try and come to terms with what, you know, I think will be this defining moment for many people, and point out a few leadership lessons, as this is a leadership seminar, to finish off. And then I'll be very happy to take questions about anything I've said or anything in The Economist. The thing that struck me as I reflected on Lehman Brothers' failure and what happened afterwards, first was that it was not just about toxic assets, but it was also about toxic ideas. That over the previous 25 years or so, a whole set of ideas have become very widely accepted by people in government and people making economic policy and people in business that had some important flaws in them. The most important failure in those ideas, I think, was that they ignored history. There was a sort of sense that you could forget about everything that happened before that last 25 years, that we'd figured out how to manage the economy without ever going into recession again. There was this notion that the British Prime Minister Gordon Brown famously talked about, where he said we're going to abolish boom and bust. But also Ben Bernanke and a number of other people who are now really shaping our economic policy had come to believe that central banks, through their use of interest rate policy, could manage the economic cycle so it didn't really ever happen again. And they called this the Great Moderation. It was a period unprecedented in history of low inflation, low unemployment. And that set of ideas, I think, was at its most simplistic, a caricature that said the market is always right, government should basically get out of the way. Something that is very, has obvious emotional appeal to it, but I think when you look at the lessons of history, as we've done in the book, it was a misplaced set of ideas. In the book, we go back throughout the history of financial bubbles and major depressions and recessions, all the way back to the famous bubbles like the tulip bubble in Amsterdam in the 17th century, the South Sea bubble in London in 1720, through to the Great Depression, the long-term capital disaster, the Enron crash, the Japanese lost decade. We draw out a whole series of different lessons. Just to give you a flavour, I mean, some of those lessons are, the lessons probably that we most need to learn are the ones that actually have us immediately kind of recoiling from them in some ways, because they don't fit many of our sort of initial assumptions about how we'd like the world to be. So one of the clear lessons is that by ignoring history, we just stopped asking whether the amounts of debt that we were piling on in our businesses, in our personal lives and in our government was sustainable or not. It was like, okay, the markets are willing to fund those amounts of debt, then it's probably all right. So serious questions were ignored. On the other hand, when it came to Lehman Brothers being on the brink of disaster, the government ignored the clear historical evidence that if you allow your banking system to collapse, it makes whatever economic problems you have many times worse. So while quite rightly we want to punish bankers who get us into difficulties through their recklessness, the way to punish them is not to allow a bank to fail, it's to bail it out and then deal with the problem of how you punish the people who got you into difficulties. All the studies show that when you have a collapse of your banking system, it makes for a very, very long, slow, painful recovery. And that's experienced in America with the Great Depression most notably, but also experiences all around the world where banking crises have occurred. And so Hank Paulson, when he allowed Lehman to fail, I think was absolutely ignoring every single lesson of history and what happened afterwards, which threatened to take a bad economy and turn it into a global Great Depression, was a pretty predictable consequence of letting Lehman Brothers fail in the way that it did. So there's a whole range of different lessons, a whole series of things that need to be done to improve the economy and get us out of the mess that we got ourselves into in the late part of 2008. Now, how does the world actually look set against the framework of lessons and reforms that we talk about in the book? And how are we doing? Well, the first thing that's important to say is that the world's governments may have ignored history in allowing Lehman Brothers to fail, but they quickly learnt the lesson of history of the 1930s in particular once they realised what a mistake they'd made, and that the reaction that we saw from governments around the world to make sure that the banking crisis was contained, that the system was stabilised, and that some and that demand was stopped from falling off a cliff, has meant that we've avoided a Great Depression, a second Great Depression. Had the events that were unfolding that September been allowed to continue in the direction that they were folding, very few, if any, of our major financial institutions would have been around today. And we'd be talking about unemployment of 20 to 25% in America rather than 10%. Now 10% is pretty miserable. I don't need to tell any of you that. But it's very hard sometimes to appreciate how lucky we are when the lucky situation we're in is pretty miserable. But we are in a much better state than we could conceivably have been in had things been allowed to unfold in the direction they were going in late September 2008. So that coordinated reaction by governments around the world, almost unprecedented in economic terms, avoided a Great Depression. Secondly, I think another thing that people thought would happen that didn't happen was that the overall global economy has proved to be much more resilient than expected. There was a few weeks where it seemed like the entire global trading system was going to fall apart. People couldn't get letters of credit on exports. Singapore's economy shrank by 14% in a quarter, sort of unprecedented for an incredibly well-run economy. The produce was piling up on the docks in China, unable to sail. It seemed like the global economy would fail, and that would be maybe the biggest cause of the Great Depression.